Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to give everyone another minute to join the webinar, and then we will begin. All right, hello everyone, and welcome to part 3 in our ASC 606 webinar series titled Lessons, Challenges, and What to Expect in 2019. So here's a high-level agenda of what we're going to be covering today. We're going to begin with a few housekeeping items and introductions to SoftTrax and Effectives Group. And then we'll go through with what lessons and challenges did companies encounter in year 1 of ASC 606. And that will really be the bulk of our presentation. And then we'll jump into some additional content on what benefits have companies received from ASC 606 with some commentary from the SEC, as well as what should companies expect going into 2019. All right, so just a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. If you do have questions, they can be submitted throughout the presentation using GoToWebinar's question box in your control panel. I will be looking at those questions as they come through, and if we have any time at the end of the presentation, we'll cover as many questions of those as we can. Otherwise, we will contact you directly following today's webinar with responses, likely from an expert from SoftTrax or Effectives Group as appropriate. This webinar is also for CPE credit, and it is awarded for completion of a 50-minute hour, as well as 4 polling questions. So please make sure you answer those 4 polling questions when you are prompted to do so, and we will send you a CPE certificate after this webinar. All right, so introductions to our presenters. My name is Kristen Lawson. I am a CPA here in Massachusetts, and I'm a sales engineer on the SoftTrax sales team. I am joined today by my colleague Graham Holm. He is the VP of Product Management here at SoftTrax, as well as Matt Svedish, who is a director at Effectives Group. So just a little bit about SoftTrax before I hand it over to Matt to introduce himself. We are based here in Boston, Massachusetts. We are a division of AFS Technology. We are on our 4th generation of architecture for our SoftTrax Revenue Manager, which is specifically designed to handle complex revenue recognition. And we have a number of offices within the US as well as across the globe. Some of our clients are generally, our traditional clients are software and SaaS-based because the guidance associated with recognizing revenue was previously very industry specific, and those are traditionally where our clients most had the complexity, were in the software and SaaS industries. Now, however, as you'll see throughout our presentation, ASC 606 has a wide range of complexities for all industries, and therefore our clients now range from e-commerce to media to hardware, telecom, equipment. It's across the board. All right, so next up, I'm going to hand you over to Matt Svedish to introduce himself and his company.
Hello, everyone. As Kristen mentioned, my name is Matt Svedish. I'm a director in the San Francisco Silicon Valley office. Our headquarters is in Silicon Valley, but we also have a presence across the US, specifically in Boston. So thank you all of you from Boston that are also joining on this call today. We've completed well over 100 ASC 606 implementation projects at this point. So I'm hoping to add some color commentary as we go through these slides with SoftTrax, and looking forward to hearing some of your questions and responding to them as well. Thank you again.
Thanks, Matt. Okay, so before we jump into our content, we're going to start here with our first polling question. And I'm just going to prompt a poll here for you within the webinar. Please make sure that you answer the question, and I will gather the results and document those for CPE purposes. So the question is, which of ASC 606's 5 steps was most challenging for your company? Was it step 1, identify the contracts with the customer? Step 2, identify the performance obligations in the contract. Step 3, determine the transaction price. Step 4, allocate the transaction price to those performance obligations in the contract. Or step 5, recognize revenue when or as the entity satisfies a performance obligation. So just a couple more seconds, and then I'll close the poll. All right, so let me actually share those results with you real quick. We have about 30% with identify the performance obligations and 30% with allocate the transaction price to those performance obligations in the contract. That's interesting. Did you have a comment on that, Graham?
No, excuse me, yes, I would say I do. It's interesting that as we've taken these types of surveys over time, the step 4 area has the percentages increased, and I think it's as people have realized, and we'll get to it in this webinar, that the complexity associated with the allocation piece. Matt, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would say, the standard isn't chronological, so oftentimes we're working on step 4, for example, and step 2 at the same time. So it doesn't surprise me that they come in at, the same or similar percentages as we go through this process and everyone learns more and more about how the standard is working.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Okay, so then let's go ahead and jump into our content. So the first thing, I'm just going to set up for you what this looks like. There is going to be a lesson or a challenge that we're going to go through at the top, and I'll walk through those couple of bullet points that we've mentioned, and then we'll jump into commentary from Graham and Matt. So the first lesson or challenge that we're going to walk through is preparation, implementation, and adoption of ASC 606 by companies required more time and resources than companies anticipated. So the first thing that we pointed out was the standard impacts various teams in an organization, from finance, sales, legal, operations, IT, and marketing. And they also, this is because it affects processes, controls, and systems across the organization. And we talked about that a little bit actually in our last webinar in part 2 of this series, just the fact we took a poll actually on, where this was creating the most impact. And of course that was in the finance department and accounting departments. But I do believe that there are implications across the board from sales, legal, operations, etc. And that's because, as we mentioned here, it requires an upfront investment in time to understand the personnel involved. Graham, do you have any comments on this?
I think, from a standpoint of describing it, one of the things that, and I've read it in articles, and I felt it resonated most was using the term that 606 has a cross-functional impact, instead of just saying, it goes, it's department specific, or it really isn't necessarily about what department you're in. It's about what you're doing, and I'll equate it to the implementations that we've done on 606 with our product, where we start out with a very small subset of accounting and finance and the planning, and then in the second or third meeting on, the group has grown by necessity across different areas of the company, some of which the initial kickoff meetings wouldn't even consider. And it wasn't necessarily department driven, it was functional. Who does this? Who does the billing? Who takes the orders in? Who effectively collects cash? And not that they do it physically, but who's in charge of it? Who understands those processes, et cetera? And just the scope was so broad that you would see the team grow. And I think it's something that we've seen, and I think one of the other lessons that we would put forward to companies and that we've seen is establishing a language, and we touched on this in our prior webinars in this series, establishing a language where when you have these different departments, different cross-functional team members in the room, that everyone's speaking the same language with respect to what does a transaction mean? How does it equate to a performance obligation? You know, what is the difference between an order to cash flow and an order to revenue flow? Establishing those definitions is key so that as these 606 adoption activities occur, everyone's on board, but then also reinforcing it as you're promoting that information above after adoption. It's been important as well. Matt, what from your standpoint, what would you say has been your experience in the field with respect to this lesson?
Graham, I think you really hit it right on the head there with regard to understanding the nomenclature of the literature. That's something that on our side we talk about all the time, making sure everyone's speaking the same language. But I'd also say, just keying in on this third bullet point here, the upfront investment and understanding by key personnel. When you're looking at what the starting point is for kicking off an ASC 606 project, it's really, if you're the controller or the revenue manager, it's taking the CFO out to lunch. And if you're the CFO, take yourself out to lunch, because there's going to be a lot of resources required, and it's going to require buy-in from those C-level executives, so to speak, because it is a fairly expensive process to implement. And also, the messaging needs to be very clear to all these different departments. And if it's just coming from the revenue project manager or the implementation project manager, it may not be enough to create a cohesive approach to ensure the implementation occurs in a timely and effective manner.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Everyone from the top down should be involved in this process, and that's the key personnel aspect is very important. Awesome, thank you guys. So I did just want to note that there are some quotes at the bottom of your screen. We did just provide sort of a quote that pertains to the lesson inherent in each slide. So those are just takeaways for you guys. So let's go on to the next one. ASC 606 is a complex standard with a large footprint. So, this is a pretty short and simple statement here, but it is very complex. It has a large footprint, which is what we just talked about in that last slide, that it goes across the company. But I think it's also important to note that it doesn't just go across the company, but it also goes across multiple industries. So although it is a new standard that has a 5-step principles-based approach that eliminates industry-specific guidance, that means it goes across all these industries, right? It's a one-size-fits-all blueprint for companies just doesn't exist. So the new areas of guidance are introduced that all companies must adhere to going forward, regardless of company size, complexity, geography, industry, etc., so that we now do have that same set of rules, because IFRS and GAAP have converged here. So, Graham, what are your comments?
On this particular topic, I think it was a direct line to some of what we call discovery information when we work with our clients on, how to really get the ball rolling with respect to 606. So some of the points that I would say would be, the company has to define, what is the definition in their world of the goods and services they provide. That would be, a key question that would, it sounds simple, but you have to ask it up front, and it can lead into the idea of complexity. But then if you go down the list, it gets into areas that maybe companies or at least members of the finance and accounting team wouldn't necessarily think directly correlate to 606. So things like, how does the company deliver their goods and services? Is it electronic? Is it physical? Is it, what have you? But then taking it a step further, what's the go-to-market approach for the goods and services? Meaning, if they're going to provide the services, deliver them in a different way, introduce a new product, maybe they're going from, an on-premise offering to a SaaS offering if it's technology, or maybe it's a subscription approach, whether it's, information delivery, which used to be a physical delivery of a magazine or a book or something like that. That whole, that paradigm in that area needs to be considered by the company. I think the other piece is, how does sales and its operation teams, what do they have to consider when they price and negotiate and write contracts? And so, as you can see, we're starting to go layers deeper than just, all right, this is an accounting and a finance function, and consequently, the answers to those questions introduce the complexity that I think this particular topic bears out. And so, you know, the other piece that we will touch on it later in this discussion, but there's been a lot of clamoring for, you know, for our industry from companies, you know, what is the industry-specific guidance to help me apply this? But there really isn't that anymore. It's a principles-based approach. So there's no template, there's no cliff notes, there's nothing simple where you can just say, all right, this is how it should work for my company. Now, you may have some good working examples based on other, you know, companies in your industry or just other companies' adoptions, but it really, the point is the same, is that the complexity stems from going deep into a company's business, but beyond that, also, there isn't, you know, one size fits all or a blueprint that you can just slap on it and say, all right, if we follow this, we'll be done in a month, or something as simple as that. Matt, based on what you've experienced, any thoughts on those points?
The way I would look at it is from a quantification perspective. I read the other day that there was 180 different pieces of industry-specific guidance under the old standard. So we're combining 180 different pieces into one, and then taking all the rules out of those 180 different pieces of guidance and saying it's principles approach, have at it. So I think it's really important that companies benchmark themselves against other companies, as well as spend some time in the guidance and understanding how it relates to their company specifically.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. 180 pieces. That's no small feat. Okay, so the next thing then that we are going to talk about is jumping into some of those complexities and really understanding what's going on. So ASC 606 requires companies to apply significant estimates and judgments, which I think is a big consideration, all puns intended there, that we also talked about in our last webinar series. We talked plenty about significant estimates and judgments, variable consideration, things like that. The new standard allows companies to use estimates and judgments for revenue recognition that were not previously permitted. And with this power comes great responsibility for companies. And I think this third bullet point actually is really important. The work involved to decide upon these estimates and judgments must be repeatable, auditable, and fully documented. There are no shortcuts. So I think that template that principles-based approach comes into play here to come out with a very consistent pattern. They really have to put some thought into it. They have to actually apply these significant estimates and judgments. And I want to jump to Matt first, actually, to get your commentary here.
Thank you very much, Kristen. This is an interesting slide to me because it ties into IT very closely. I think where companies get stuck is they try and figure out what their method's going to be used, or what the method is they're going to utilize for the significant estimates and judgments without looking at the data set that they have. So what will my IT system actually produce for me? And then based on that, how can I develop the estimates and apply any judgments that I need to? So as a starting point, when working your way through this process, whether it be for a material right, which we'll discuss later, or variable consideration, or establishing a standalone selling price, which is what used to be called VSOE at fair value, all those aspects should be considered and applied to the data that you already have. Don't reinvent the wheel as part of this process. Really look at the data that you have already in your system and see how it can be applied to the ASC 606 standard.
Thank you. Graham?
I think, Matt, you just hit on something we see quite often, which is, and we've run into it when we've worked with clients in the past, and we've actually introduced tasks to help them avoid it going forward, which is, Matt's exactly right in the sense that it's fine to go down a path, but what we found is that they make a decision and then they backtrack and look, okay, our source systems provide X and Y, but not Z. And Z is critical to be able to execute against the decision or implementation track for 606. And so then then it's trying to fit, a shape into, a square into a round hole or whatever you want to call it, because then it's a matter of, all right, can we get this data out of our system or not, versus taking a starting point approach, as Matt mentions, and figuring out, okay, what do we have to offer initially, and how should that, and are we going to keep it as it stands, or are we going to augment it in terms of our IT systems to support our 606 implementation? And so that is absolutely an empirical example that we can attest to from our experience, just in implementing customers on our product for 606.
Yeah, I think it's really valuable to add the thought about IT, as well as the controls that are inherent in that process, from an auditability standpoint that was in that last point, and that consistency standpoint. All right, so the next one is, to date, the disclosure requirements have introduced complexity and a higher level of effort to close financial reporting cycles. So even those, even the projects without material impact really have to, they take a lot of time to produce accurate quantitative and qualitative disclosures. This entire series is about ASC 6 disclosures, SEC commentary, challenges, those types of things. But disclosures are really at the heart of this process, because the SEC wants to see quantitative and qualitative information, how you got there, what you got, why you got it, when. Those kinds of things need to be explained in your results in those financial statements. So companies must be consistent with what they disclose and all details leading to these disclosures across the reports. Otherwise, the SEC has noted they will ask for clarification. So that's, again, kind of segueing on what we just talked about from a consistency standpoint, auditability standpoint. That's very important to the SEC. Okay, Graham, what are your comments here?
So to that point, I think our September webinar, it provided a number of examples where the company's filings in either the early adoption period or in year one in 606, they fell short with respect to disclosures, and the SEC, pointed out via comment letters. And so I think one of the takeaways, and it is something we noted last month, is that it's regardless of whether a company identifies whether it does or does not qualify for certain disclosure or one or many disclosure requirements in 606, it's imperative they explain how they came up to that decision and what went into it. And Matt hit on it a few minutes ago, quantitatively, when he used that example of over, using a number to apply to the actual reasoning, but also qualitatively. This is, and Matt, I'm stealing a quote here from last month, so I will attribute it to you, but it's tell your story, take credit for the work that you're doing. And I thought that resonated well when Matt said it last month, is just saying we don't qualify for this disclosure requirement isn't enough. You have to explain what part of, why you decided that, explain in detail with a story that can line up and support it. And then in the best filings that we reviewed that, to date, they provided a specific scenario that explained why a disclosure requirement wouldn't be applicable, a quick 1 to 2 sentence scenario in their notes section of their filing. And so obviously it introduces a lot more work, but it appears to be the level of detail that the SEC is looking for to really justify how companies are ruling themselves in or out in terms of these disclosure requirements. Matt, in your experience working with companies, is there anything to add there?
I would say in terms of a starting point for the disclosure requirements, KPMG has a separate guide that's just on disclosures. That's definitely worth reading and will help out in terms of benchmarking. Also, of course, looking at competitors, because as a public entity, the propensity would be that you would not want to disclose more than what your competitor is disclosing. Otherwise, it may put you at a disadvantage for one reason or another. So just making sure that that's consistent across the board is really important. And then also reviewing again the MD&A section, if you are filing a 10K or 10Q, reviewing the MD&A section and making sure that whatever the value proposition is described by performance obligation at your company, whatever that value proposition looks like, that it's described in the same way in the footnotes to the financials. we've seen a number of cases where it's been very inconsistent between the MD&A section and the financial statement footnotes.
Interesting. Yeah. So again, consistency is key in terms of your financial reports and the processes that you're following for controls and audit standpoint, as well as presentationally. I think that goes back to the point that we talked about in our last webinar, though, that this is sort of more of an art than it is a science. There is no perfect way for you to do this, but as long as you are consistent with your methodology and, you know, they can understand why you did something, how you did it, those types of things, it's very important. So I think that Pablo Picasso quote there at the bottom is very applicable. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is prompt the second polling question. So please take a moment to answer the question that should now be on your screen. In which area of your company did ASC 606 have the most unexpected impact? Unexpected being the key word there. Employee commissions and bonuses, budgeting and forecasting, tax compliance or banking covenants, board, analyst, and investor communications, or all of the above. So I'll give you probably 15 or 20 more seconds, and then we will collect those responses and share. All right, we're going to close this poll. All right, so almost 30% with all of the above, no shock there. Budgeting and forecasting was the next, okay, so, and then followed by employee commissions and bonuses, which consider that one. We will talk about that one in a little bit. And then board analyst and investor communications and tax compliance or banking covenants. Graham, any comments on these results?
It doesn't surprise me. I think there's nothing here that really stands out. It's similar to what we've seen in prior surveys. I think from a perspective of the commissions and bonuses we're going to touch on, and that has resonated, and we have that has come up frequently in our dialogue, especially as we've dealt with our existing customer base and then prospects as we've gone forward. It's come up to an extent after the fact versus an initial, you know, here's a requirement that we really need your help with. Okay. And so that's a key takeaway I would put forward on that front, and in terms of the first row here related to employee commissions and bonuses.
Yeah. Matt, do you have any additional comments?
I would key in on this board analysis and investor communications. One of the areas you could call of communication breakdown that we see sometimes is, for example, a company may choose to use the modified approach versus the full retrospective approach, which results in the periods presented not being comparable. One is under the old standard, and then the new period is under the new standard. And no one communicated that to the board, so then it all suddenly gets up to the board, and they're like, no, we wanted to take the full retrospective approach and have both, let's say, our 2018 and 2019 financials under the same standard. So making sure to communicate with your board and whoever the relevant investors are is really important. Kind of towards the beginning of the adoption of the new standard. Don't wait until the end, otherwise there could be some changes in store.
Yeah, so that definitely goes back to that point that we made at the beginning about doing the work up front, and really that top-down discussion, you know, making sure you include the CFO, you include those C-suite executives, and now even your board, your investors. I think that's important. That's a great point. All right, so the next one that we're going to talk about, we're going to get into a little bit more technical detail here with this one, and jump right into some more 606 complexity with allocation and standalone selling price requirements. I do think this has been quite a big lesson and challenge, especially after seeing that initial poll result that said that allocating the transaction price down to those performance obligations was one of the biggest challenges that you had all faced. So here, the standalone selling price concept introduced complexity even to those familiar with the SOE from prior industry-specific revenue recognition guidance. So as I mentioned, maybe allocation was you know, inherent in the software and SaaS business, but now they have standalone selling price requirements, and this has all changed from that industry-specific guidance. So the level of effort to collect analyze, apply, and maintain these standalone selling prices is a new challenge. So applying it correctly and consistently to calculate those allocations is, again, another layer of effort. So Matt, I'm curious as to what your comments would be on this one first.
Yeah, I would say, first of all, companies that were under the software standard in the past didn't have to establish VSOE for their license, but now under the new standard they will. The impact of that is pretty significant, specifically for companies, let's say, that are on a term license. So let's say you have a 1-year license. The license is recognized up front over the term license now, and the support, or PCS, is recognized over time. So if you think about how your allocation works, let's say normally you would recognize 80% up front for the license and 20% for support. That now needs to be, justified, let's say, by performing a standalone selling price analysis. And in the past, if companies haven't had to do that for the license amount, it can be a little bit tricky, and you may end up with a ratio that's a little bit different. In addition, the level of granularization that the standalone selling price needs to be performed at is catching companies off guard. My recommendation is this be performed at the SKU level or the product code level, because later on, when the results of the SSP analysis needs to be incorporated into your IT system, that's the level that it'll be incorporated at, that SKU or product level. So I would encourage everyone to make sure to focus on that when going through and determining the appropriate approach for the standalone selling price. It's a significant amount of effort, and many companies oftentimes are having to update this every quarter, particularly if you're a growing company and potentially the economics or the way you sell your product is changing very quickly as you grow.
That's a great point. Graham?
Yeah, it's a really comprehensive point. I mean, I think it touches on a number of the takeaways I had on this. I think from a practical standpoint, when we worked with our clients, Matt really hit it directly, which is the idea for a company that dealt with industry-specific guidance, where, let's say, VSOE or some concept that aligned with SSP or standalone selling price, under 606 existed. They have the concepts down. Now, applying it, to Matt's point, is a different story in some cases. But for companies that didn't have this, it's new territory. So doing it at the SKU level is absolutely what we've seen as a requirement as well. I think beyond that, we've seen the idea that of companies trying to store this data in a spreadsheet that takes minutes to open, and that's how big this pricing matrix ends up becoming. And so one of the takeaways that we've really, from our lesson learned, is that we have companies really take a hard look. In your SKU catalog or product catalog, are they really different products that you're pricing differently or not? It sounds like a basic question, but we call it, the proliferation of SKUs that can really cause unintended consequences in terms of calculating these prices. So that's something that, as companies have taken on this issue or this requirement in 606, they've really kept an eye out for, okay, what are we truly selling now versus what exists in our catalog, and what can we accurately price for the purposes of standalone selling price requirement. I think the other thing that sneaks up on companies in the lesson learned is it's not just calculating it to get it adopted, it's the ongoing assessment and recalculation of those prices over time based on that company's business, their business conditions, And so, whether that's quarterly, annually, it's dependent upon how the company, sells the product and, et cetera, and how their transactions are processed. But regardless, it's not just the upfront piece, it's the assessment and reassessment and assignment of that SSP over time. There's work involved with that. And we've seen that's where, the brute force approach can be challenging if there isn't an eye towards, at some point, automating it or streamlining it in some way.
Yeah. So that application, but also maintenance piece of the standalone selling prices and looking back at historical information. Okay, so I think actually the next one segues very nicely. Contract modifications introduced unexpected impacts for companies. And so if the price and or scope of a contract changes, then companies need to assess the contract modification and combination requirements of ASC 606 closely. Companies need to identify a repeatable process, that's a consistency that we keep mentioning, on an ongoing basis. And then this area of ASC 606 is one that branches well beyond the finance team to multiple areas of the company. So again, we are just reiterating things that we have already spoken about, already mentioned, and even talking back to those unexpected impacts, right, all across industries, all across the company, in different processes and controls that we've already touched on. So Graham, what are your thoughts on this?
I think this particular challenge area in 606, what we've seen is this is where all of the lessons converge in terms of, you have judgments, you have estimates, you have SSP, you have allocation, and then you have the baseline requirements associated with putting all those together and determining, all right, do I have a contract modification or not? And so, the baseline rules such as, how do I determine, how do I train up my team, how do I automate the determination of whether I have a contract modification or a new contract? It involves and intersects with these challenge areas. And so in many cases, as Matt alluded to earlier, and I think the guidance isn't inherently chronological, and this gets into that topic in my mind because some of the challenges that go into contract modification considerations are they're effectively going to converge with the other factors we've talked about, because you need to have a solid SSP and a solid allocation process that's repeatable so that when you identify contract modifications or new contracts, you're treating it properly versus not. And so when we've dealt with customers, there's been a lot of activity around contract modifications just on paper before they put it into the system in terms of, okay, I bring in this. They have to plan because they have to identify, all right, what types of deals do we sign? What do we allow customers to do after they sign? And what's the window of time we allow them to do it? Can they cancel or not? All of those questions really open up, and it's really been, we've seen it when we've been in the room, it opens up a number of areas for the teams at companies to learn about the business that they otherwise didn't know much about. And then in many cases, it's streamlined operations. So this one really is where I think all of the parts come together, at least in our view. Matt, is this something that you've seen challenging for companies when you've dealt with them in the area of contract modifications?
Yes, for sure. And I guess the way I would approach this slide is by giving a quick example on how this can become complex very quickly. So even companies that typically enter into, let's say, 1-year contracts, and then they renew in the second year, if your renewal occurs, let's say, 3 or 4 months before the end of the year 1 term, that could be viewed as a modification, or it could have some impact. So even something as simple as that, which in the past, didn't really cause a lot of angst under ASC 605, will now need to be looked at very closely and documented, both within your adoption memo as well as within the IT framework to make sure any impact is properly flagged and recalculated.
Yeah. I think this quote is also one that sums it up very nicely. It says, all great changes are preceded by chaos. So maybe these contract modifications are chaotic, but great changes do come, and we will touch on those benefits here towards the end of the presentation. So don't worry, there are benefits to ASC 606. All right, so the next lessons and challenge that we're going to focus on is variable consideration. ASC 606's variable consideration requirement required a heavy investment of time and resources. So, we did touch on this a little bit earlier when we talked about estimates and judgments, but I told you we would come back to it because variable consideration is one of those complexities that we have seen a lot, and it has required a heavy investment of time and resources. So, it has set a new requirement in ASC 606 Minimal historical examples or results that companies could use to streamline their understanding and adoption of the requirement are available, and it can be implicit or explicit in a contract. So again, it requires significant judgment and estimates, and it requires the company to be strong with its controls, processes, procedures, and documentation to ensure that repeatable justification over time, so that consistency piece. I think what catches my eye initially is that minimal historical examples are available because this is a new concept. So people are kind of wondering what they do moving forward with variable consideration, because it can be implicit or explicit, and that's what leads to this judgment. Matt, I'm curious what your take is on this challenge.
The way I would look at this is the days of saying we don't know exactly where this contract is going to end up, so we're just going to recognize it on a completed contract basis, or whenever that final amount is determined, are gone. The way to look at variable consideration is now upfront. Companies are having to estimate what the value of that variable consideration is, and there's two methods that are typically being applied to variable consideration. One is the expected value method, and the other is the most likely amount method. The expected value method is the sum of a probability weighted amount within a range of possible considerations. So if you think about it from our old economics days in college and whatnot, so it's a probable weighted measurement. Versus the most likely method is you're choosing the single most likely amount within a range of possibilities. So you're saying this is exactly how much it's going to be. It's going to be exactly $1 million engagement. So it's important that companies understand these different methods and how variable consideration will be impactful on their contracts. And the one thing I would make sure that everyone's aware of is don't try and jump to the conclusion too soon, because oftentimes we see companies that start under, let's say, the expected value method, and then later on determine, actually, we do have a pretty good idea of exactly how much we'll receive, and they move over to the most likely amount method. And it may vary from contract to contract as well. Graham, did you have any thoughts on that?
We did. I do. I think, from a standpoint, I mean, you hit from the technical accounting side, really what we hear when we're dealing with this. I would say that many of the clients that we've engaged with, and I would say, I'm not suggesting they're steering away from it intentionally, but it's one of those things they want to be absolutely sure they have to do it before they invest a lot of time to do it, as Matt said. And I think what I would say is this, is that it hasn't been the most intuitive portion of the guidance based on the input we've received from our clients. The words are certainly understood, but it is one of the areas when we've talked to them, they're asking, even with the examples in the guidance, I think their point is it's still unclear how that would apply to my business. How does it apply to our industry? And so one of the biggest takeaways was that it just wasn't as intuitive as the other parts of the guidance where, they could correlate it to some experience they had either, through transactions in the past or the guidance spoke to them with greater clarity. So I know that's somewhat, touchy-feely with respect to how I'm explaining it, but this is definitely an area, as Matt said, that that not only companies, need to think about up front, but from our standpoint, one of the things that they told us they struggled with is it's not just estimating the variable consideration at the contract's inception. It was having a repeatable ability to reassess it periodically to factor in any changes to facts or circumstances, business conditions, et cetera. So that not only making sure it's not a set it and forget it item by any means, it's something that requires work along the line to reassess. And those are the key takeaways when we've dealt with companies on variable consideration.
Yeah. Yep. I think moving forward for sure. Okay. So I promised you we would talk about benefits, and we will finally move on to some benefits. So what benefits have companies received? Companies are better informed about end-to-end contract to revenue processes. So we have outlined a couple of key benefits here, but I think this is just generally companies should be looking at this as a glass half full kind of idea, right? Companies are better informed. So while there has been a lot of work that has to go into this, a lot of challenges that companies have faced, and probably a lot of stress, probably a lot of gray hair, but there are benefits to this. You are better informed about your entire company and the entire process. So the broad efforts required by companies to adopt 606 and allows, I think is a nice word, forced companies to do a solid introspection on policies, procedures, and controls regarding revenue recognition and beyond. Companies can identify what is working, not working, and then address those areas as a holistic approach. So they can look at all the processes and procedures involved across the company. So teams become better informed about financial and operational activities, and they can contribute to revenue recognition. So that's that cross-functional relationship that Graham mentioned at the very beginning. And then, of course, internal systems can be updated, improved, and modernized as part of the ASC 606 project. So those IT systems and controls and the data flow is very important. The last one provides an opportunity to update and improve commissions and bonus policies. This one, I want to jump to Matt so he can give me comments on this one right up front.
Yeah, so the opportunity for commission and bonus policies to be updated just cannot be understated. Typically, companies have moved from, let's say, a startup phase, to a growth phase, and then, maybe even they're looking at a potential IPO. And what's happened is during each one of those phases, instead of the commission and bonus policy being replaced, it just got layered on top of the old policy. So then when you go to try and analyze the commission and bonus policies under the new standard, companies are oftentimes realize, okay, we have all these layered, processes and systems that we have to also consider within the guidance. And so what companies are doing is they're saying, okay, why don't we just rewrite the commission policy within the framework and vernacular of the new guidance and implement those results into our IT system going forward, whatever IT system you use for tracking commissions. So it's a really big opportunity for companies. And one way from talking to executives, one of the best approaches is saying how much time individuals are placing on calculating the commissions and bonuses. Oftentimes, executives are unaware, 50, 100 hours, a quarter are being spent just calculating commissions and bonuses because of this layering effect of the policies over time.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Graham, what's your comments here?
Matt's answer was better than anything I would provide. No, I think it was comprehensive. The one thing I would add to it is that from our experiences that it's not fluff. It really, we have seen it in actual application, real world scenarios where by having cross-functional education and interactions through the 606 implementation, as companies change their business models, added new product offerings, had new terms in their contracts, as Matt mentioned, changes in bonus and compensation plans, they were better equipped to handle those than they were prior to 606. And so I'm not suggesting that all of the work that went into it, I'm not making a judgment or a value statement there, but it is one of the benefits that was pronounced and has been articulated to us when we've engaged with our customers after the fact. And so it is something I would just, to further Matt's point that we have seen.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Okay, so then next up, we are going to gather another polling question. So I think this is the perfect time to ask you what was or is expected to be the most valuable benefit your company has received from ASC 606. So improved systems and controls, better educated organization on end-to-end contract or revenue processes, more efficient month-end and quarter-end close processes, higher quality financial reports. So this could be due to quantitative and or qualitative information added to these reports, or all of the above or other. Give you a couple more seconds and then we'll close this and share the results. All right, 53% better educated on those processes. So we're really glad to hear that. Graham, do you have any comments on this?
No, it's good to hear that I mean, this aligns with the input we've received from our customers and prospects. I mean, as with most things, when you put a lot of effort into it, you get a lot out of it. And I think in this case, the education on the contract to revenue process, it was a staple of the input we received.
Yeah, it's nice to see that people have turned those challenges into benefits.
There's a lot of other color commentary we received in addition to it, but that was the benefit, yes.
Matt, do you have any other thoughts on the results here?
I get a lot of feedback from companies just saying how much better they understand the monetization effort, within the contract to revenue processes. So, where is the value proposition, and how is that being articulated by those that are out there selling the products? In the past, there may have been a little bit of a disconnect on that, and the way this new standard, forces you to implement is by making sure that whatever the monetization effort is up front, it's being captured within the the results within revenue and costs.
Yeah, I think that was a really great way to put it. All right, so we'll move on. And I know you're all curious to know, what does the SEC have to say about this? So in August of 2018, the CPA Journal published an article named Current Developments at the SEC, and it detailed key ASC 606 input from a panel that included Norman Strauss, Wesley Bricker, Kyle Moffitt, and Charles Wright, all in separate divisions there. But we will focus on comments from Kyle Moffitt as well as Wesley Bricker to understand sort of what they have to say about the process to date as well as moving forward. So Kyle Moffitt, Chief Accountant at the SEC's Division of Corporate Finance, acknowledged that the transition was causing a lot of frustration among corporate directors. The implementation was really a pain, and it was a significant cost burden, not only the cost, but the systems to put in place and the man hours. So in spite of the standard's stated goal of providing a single framework for recognition, many are pushing back, asking for industry-specific guidance once again. Graham, I'm curious, what do you have to say about this?
This is a tactful way of putting what we've heard in the field forward. I think, yes. No, I mean, it is what we've heard. It is what we've seen. I think with respect to how at least our customers and prospects have viewed the level of effort and costs, both real and opportunity costs, the input we've received in many cases is that was substantially higher than the benefit that was received. But having said that, there's an acknowledgement by companies that it's a limited window of time to evaluate the benefit, whereas you feel the cost immediately up front. So, but this sentiment is in line, and I think it's a good acknowledgement of what frustration is a good term of how I would characterize the input we've received, and we'll touch on in a moment in an additional slide of some notable points there, but those are the key takeaways that I would say when I look at this. There's nothing that surprises me here. It is in fact the input we're getting, and we continue to get as we engage with companies, but they know they have to do it. So at a certain point, the issues and frustration ceases, and we move on. But that's what I hear.
Matt, you have any additional comments?
No, I completely agree with what Graham was saying there.
Okay. Well, then let's look at another comment here from Wesley Bricker, Chief Accountant at the SEC's Office of the Chief Accountant. Some companies point out rightly that the impact in the primary financial statements was not all that significant, and therefore they say the cost of implementation doesn't match our perception of the benefit. That argument tends to minimize the greater benefit of the standard, which is the disclosure package and the quantitative and qualitative disclosure elements that are now provided to investors about contracts with customers. And I think this is actually a really great point, because he's essentially saying that the greater good that this provides is more important than the perception for companies' individual benefits, because that ultimate goal is to provide users, which would be those investors, with information about what's happening within the company. Graham, what are your comments here?
I think it's an extension of what I just put forward in the prior slide, but what I would say is this, is that, you know, you have a juxtaposition here. You have the governing bodies, you know, FASB, SEC, IASB, the viewpoint of the greater good, which makes sense. I think the flip side is the greater good is still in question because to date, many of the articles and studies, surveys, et cetera, on 606 that we've gone through and that we've noted talking to our customers and prospects is that even with those benefits being stated up front, there's still confusion when they're consuming the financial statements of companies that have adopted. And so I think there's still a settling period that needs to occur so that the benefits can be clearly seen, because the value points that are being put forward, at least by the SEC in this case, based on what we've seen, I don't know that the market is agreeing with it, is how I would put it. Now, I think as maybe the pain or challenges associated with adoption wear away, you can have a cleaner or a more transparent eye as to whether that view remains. But that's our view on it right now, is that's still in question, and the benefits are in question because there's still confusion when people are consuming the output of some of the company's financials. In some cases, not in all, but in some, under the 606 standard compared to prior accounting guidance. Matt, what do you think about this one?
I completely agree with the settling period, and you know that's why after our poll question here, we have a couple of slides on what we should expect in 2019. This is a standard that companies will need to continue to pay attention to as more and more information is obtained through these public company filings, and it could change your entire rev rec depending on the specific facts and circumstances of your model once additional guidance is put out there, either by the SEC or some other governing agency.
Okay. Yeah. Excuse me, Matt was correct. We do have one more polling question that I'm going to go ahead and prompt you with now. Which of the following would most help your company with ASC 6 going into 2019? And so he did say that we were going to look at expectations next, so what we are expecting based on some more SEC comments. Oh, I'm sorry, guys, it hasn't been launched. Here we go. Please take a 30 seconds or so to vote, and then we'll move forward on those comments that the SEC has on moving into 2019. So are you looking for additional human resources, so headcount and finance and accounting, additional training for existing internal teams from an outside expert, maybe upgrades and enhancements to those internal systems or applications, or more clarifying instruction or guidance from authoritative bodies? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close this poll and share the results. All right, so 40% almost with more clarifying guidance from the authoritative bodies, and followed up closely with upgrades and enhancements to internal controls. And in the essence of time, I am unfortunately not going to ask for commentary on that one, but rather present our last two slides here for you, and run through them. So Wesley Bricker, the Chief Accountant, again at the Office of the Chief Accountant, said that the disclosures should identify both the accounting policies as well as the critical judgments and assumptions that went into applying the standard and the effects on contracts with customers. So the focus there is on those disclosures that he mentioned previously. So it's important to describe what the company knows about the anticipated effect of the adoption. You don't necessarily have to tell them more than you know or less than you know, but you do have to tell them what you know and how you got there. And then last but not least, Kyle Moffitt said, again, something we highlighted in our last webinar, we are not planning to beat up companies. Comments will only be issued when disclosures are problematic or unclear, and we're not going to use a checklist. We're going to think about the totality of the information being presented. So, Graham, what are your comments here?
I think quickly, knowing we're up against it, I would say this, is that reading between the lines, well, reading directly and then also between the lines, there's still a certain amount of subjectivity that companies have to prepare for with respect to the SEC's view on their filings and results and how they present 606 information. The statement that we're not going to use a checklist, that means companies should be their own devil's advocate, so to speak, in terms of going through the areas mentioned earlier in this meeting, but also looking at the fact, is it repeatable? And this is where we think moving from a people-driven process to an automated process via an application could be helpful. But yeah, I think companies are going to have to keep this in mind, that there is still some subjectivity that their results will be viewed through as they move forward.
Yeah. Matt, any additional comments before our time runs out?
I would just say look at discorroborating evidence to any assertion that's disclosed. Make sure that companies are not saying something that's the opposite, for example, like I mentioned earlier in the MD&A section, than what's being said in the footnote. It's been known to happen. It happens quite often, so really look for any discorroborating evidence.
All right, that consistency is key. Okay, well, just to highlight a couple of our upcoming webinars, we do have one this Thursday, so if you all are interested in some more information on automating revenue recognition, ASC 606 compliance, and beyond, please visit our website there at the bottom, www.softtracks.com. We also have another webinar coming up in November. It's on November 13th. It's ASC 606 Automation and Control. And then we'll have another part in this series, part 4, in December. So be on the lookout for invitations to the November and December webinars. I also want to thank our co-hosts here, Graham and Matt. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise. They will be providing answers to any questions that came through today. I apologize that we didn't get to answer any of them, but we will be looking for those questions and submit answers to you as soon as possible. We will post all webinar resources, so this slide deck as well as those additional resources posted here at the end for you guys on our webpage. And CPE certificates will be coming through for all of those who participated. Thank you all so much for your time. I hope you have a great rest of your day.